A pregnant woman in a wheelchair was humiliated, accused of faking her condition, and denied access to a family day at an amusement park. But when her husband, an FBI agent, arrived, everything changed. What started as an ordinary outing turned into a heated confrontation that shocked onlookers and exposed deep-rooted injustice. The fallout? Unimaginable. Do you want to know how this explosive encounter ended and why it made national heroes? Bookmark go back. Before we dive into this jaw-dropping story of courage, outrage, and redemption, comment below where you're watching from today. And if this story keeps you on the edge of your seat, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. The sun blazed high in the sky, its golden rays casting a warm glow over Silver Pines Amusement Park. The air buzzed with the cheerful screams of children on roller coasters, bursts of laughter, and the upbeat rhythm of carnival music. It was the perfect summer day, filled with boundless joy and carefree moments. Families roamed about, carrying balloons, ice creams, and stuffed toys, while the scent of fried treats wafted through the air. Amidst the lively crowd, Linda Carter carefully maneuvered her wheelchair along the wide, paved paths of the park. Her hands gripped the wheels firmly, her movements steady despite the occasional unevenness of the ground. Linda was a black woman in her late 30s, radiant with resilience and determination. In the final months of a high-risk pregnancy, medical complications had left her reliant on a wheelchair for mobility. Although the adjustment had been challenging, Linda faced it with grace and strength, prioritizing her family's happiness above her own struggles. Walking beside Linda was her 8-year-old son, Evan, his energy boundless as he skipped ahead before circling back to his mother. His bright eyes sparkled with excitement, reflecting the delight of every child at the park. "Mom, can we ride the Ferris wheel first? It looks so cool." Evan tugged at her sleeve, his eagerness infectious. Linda smiled warmly at him, her exhaustion momentarily forgotten. "Of course, sweetheart. But we need to get a special pass first," she replied, gesturing toward a smaller side path that led to the accessible entrance. This day was supposed to be special. Linda's husband, Alan Carter, a dedicated FBI agent, had promised to meet them at the park once he finished his work obligations. Knowing how much Evan had been looking forward to this outing, Linda decided to arrive early, determined to make her son's day magical, despite her physical challenges. As they made their way toward the accessible entrance, the bustling noise of the park faded slightly, replaced by the gentle rustling of leaves from the trees lining the quieter path. The shade was a welcome relief from the blazing sun, and for a moment, Linda allowed herself to relax, enjoying the simple beauty of the day. But her sense of peace didn't last long. At the gate to the accessible entrance stood a security guard, his burly frame and crossed arms projecting an air of authority. His name tag read, Greg Thompson. His sharp eyes locked onto Linda and Evan as they approached, his expression shifting from neutral to something that made Linda feel uneasy, an edge of suspicion, almost disdain. "Hello," Linda said politely, stopping her wheelchair just short of the gate. "We're here to get access to the ride area. I have my documents if you need to check them." She lifted a folder containing her medical records, offering it forward. Greg didn't move from his spot. Instead, he glanced down at Linda, then at Evan, before shaking his head slightly. "You sure you're in the right place?" he asked, his tone gruff and unfriendly. "This area is for people who actually need it." Linda's smile faltered, and her stomach tightened. The implication in his words was painfully clear. Taking a slow, steadying breath, she reminded herself to stay calm. "I do need it," Linda replied, her voice measured. She opened the folder, holding up the papers for him to see. "I'm pregnant and dealing with complications that make it difficult for me to walk. That's why I'm using a wheelchair." Greg barely glanced at the documents. "You don't look like you need it that bad," he muttered, his eyes narrowing. "You'd be surprised how many people fake this sort of thing to get special treatment." The dismissal in his voice stung. Evan, sensing his mother's discomfort, moved closer to her side, his small hand gripping the armrest of her wheelchair. Linda tightened her grip on the folder, a mixture of frustration and anxiety rising in her chest. "I understand your concerns," she said, trying to keep her tone composed, "but I'm not here to take advantage of anything. I have a legitimate need, and I can provide any documentation you require to verify that." Greg's expression didn't soften. If anything, his gaze grew colder. He took a step closer, towering over Linda in her seated position. "A doctor's note isn't proof enough these days," he said, his voice dismissive. "You know how many people pull this kind of stunt? We have to make sure the ones who really need it get access." Linda's patience was wearing thin. Her muscles tensed, but she forced herself to keep calm, knowing that escalating the situation would only make things worse. "Here are my medical records," she said firmly, extending the folder toward him again. "Please take a closer look if you have doubts." Greg snorted, barely glancing at the documents before pushing them back. "Like I said, anyone can get a doctor to sign off on something. You'll have to do better than that." Humiliation and anger boiled within Linda, but she refused to let it show. "I've done everything I'm supposed to do," she replied, her voice steady despite the growing lump in her throat. "I've provided the proper documentation, and I have every right to use this entrance." By now, a few park visitors had started to notice the interaction, their curious glances turning into concerned stares. Greg's condescending tone and refusal to listen were impossible to ignore. Evan looked up at his mother, his wide eyes full of worry. "Is everything okay, Mommy?" he whispered, clutching her arm tighter. Linda reached out to stroke his hair, forcing a reassuring smile. "It's fine, sweetheart," she said softly. "We're just sorting something out." But inside, she was far from calm. Greg, clearly unmoved, reached for his radio. "I think I'll have to call this in," he announced, his tone laced with disdain. "Too many people trying to cheat the system these days. Better safe than sorry." Linda's heart sank as the words registered. Her mind raced, searching for a way to de-escalate the situation before it spiraled further out of control. "Please," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "I'm not trying to cause any problems. I'm just here to give my son a nice day at the park." But Greg had already called for backup, and the weight of onlookers' stares grew heavier. Linda felt a wave of helplessness as she glanced down at Evan, who was gripping her arm like a lifeline. She had come to the park hoping for a day of joy, but now she was caught in a storm of suspicion and hostility. The sounds of the amusement park seemed distant now, muffled by the pounding of her heart. Bookmark, the situation had just begun, and Linda knew things could get much worse. The sound of distant chatter mixed with the carnival music as Linda waited by the gate, her heart pounding with frustration and unease. Evan stayed close, holding onto her wheelchair as if sensing the growing tension. Meanwhile, Greg Thompson, the security guard, stood rigidly by the gate, his hand resting on the radio clipped to his belt. He exuded a false sense of authority, and his condescending smirk only added to Linda's discomfort. Moments later, the distant flashing of red and blue lights broke through the haze of the afternoon sun. A police cruiser pulled up to the accessible entrance gate, drawing the attention of nearby parkgoers. Whispers rippled through the crowd, and more people began to gather, curious about the growing commotion. Linda clenched her fists tightly, her knuckles turning white as she steeled herself for what was to come. She had hoped to avoid involving the authorities, but now it was too late. The car door swung open and out stepped Officer James Lawson. Broad-shouldered with a square jaw, his uniform was perfectly pressed, and he walked with the swagger of someone accustomed to being in control. His expression shifted from indifferent to skeptical as he approached, his eyes narrowing when they landed on Linda in her wheelchair. "What seems to be the problem here?" Lawson asked, his tone carrying an edge of impatience. Greg quickly stepped forward to explain, his voice low but loud enough for Linda to hear. "This woman claims she needs access to the rides for people with disabilities," he said, gesturing dismissively toward Linda. "But her papers don't seem convincing, and I've seen too many people trying to scam their way in lately." Lawson's eyes flicked back to Linda, his brow furrowing as if he had already made a judgment. "Ma'am," he said, his voice firm, "I've been told there's a concern about the legitimacy of your need for this entrance. Do you have any proof to back up your claim?" Linda swallowed hard, struggling to suppress her rising frustration. She reached for the folder of documents she had prepared, her hands trembling slightly as she extended it toward him. "I've already shown these to the security guard," she explained, her voice steady despite her nerves. "These are my medical records. I'm in the 3rd trimester of a complicated pregnancy, and I can't walk long distances without risking my health. That's why I'm in a wheelchair. Lawson took the folder, flipping through the papers briefly before handing it back without so much as a glance at the details. Anyone can get a doctor's note, he said dismissively. Linda's jaw tightened. She could feel her patience slipping away, but she knew she couldn't afford to let her emotions get the better of her. I'm not asking for special treatment, she said firmly. I'm asking for the accommodations I'm entitled to under the law. Evan tugged at her sleeve, his voice barely a whisper. Mommy, are we in trouble? Linda bent down slightly, her hand brushing through his curls in a soothing motion. No, sweetheart, she said softly. We're just trying to sort this out. Lawson, however, seemed unmoved. He crossed his arms over his chest and took a step closer to Linda, looming over her. If you're really unable to walk, then prove it, he said, his tone sharp. Stand up and show me you can't move. The words hit Linda like a physical blow, a mix of humiliation and rage coursing through her veins. Her body tensed, and she gripped the armrests of her wheelchair as though anchoring herself against the waves of indignity crashing over her. I already told you, Linda said through gritted teeth. It's dangerous for me to walk. I'm not going to risk my health to satisfy your suspicion. Lawson's gaze hardened. Then I have no choice but to consider this an attempt to exploit the system, he said. If you don't cooperate, we'll have to take further action. Further action? Linda repeated incredulously. What exactly do you mean by that? The officer's hand moved toward his radio, and Linda's heart sank. She could feel the eyes of the growing crowd on her, the weight of their stares pressing down like a physical burden. Some onlookers whispered among themselves, while others openly recorded the interaction on their phones. Lawson pressed the button on his radio, speaking into it with a calm yet authoritative tone. Dispatch, I need additional units at the north gate of Silver Pines Amusement Park, he said. We've got a situation that needs handling. Linda's stomach turned at the word situation, as though her presence alone had become a problem to be solved. She glanced down at Evan, whose wide eyes brimmed with fear. Mommy, he whispered, his voice trembling, are they going to take us away? No, baby, Linda said, though the uncertainty in her own heart made the reassurance feel hollow. Greg Thompson, emboldened by the presence of law enforcement, stepped forward with a smug grin. See, I told you, he said loudly enough for the crowd to hear. People think they can just walk in here and game the system. The tension in Linda's chest reached a breaking point. I am not trying to game anything, she said, her voice trembling with a mix of anger and disbelief. I am a mother trying to enjoy a day at the park with my son. I've shown you my documents, I've followed the rules, and you're treating me like a criminal. Lawson raised a hand to silence her. Ma'am, calm down, he said, his tone patronizing. The more you argue, the worse this will get. Linda opened her mouth to respond, but before she could, the sound of another car pulling up interrupted her. She turned her head to see a second police cruiser arrive, its flashing lights casting a surreal glow over the scene. 2 more officers stepped out, their expressions a mix of curiosity and caution as they approached. The crowd, now numbering in the dozens, began to murmur louder. Some bystanders voiced their disapproval, calling out phrases like, "This is wrong," and "Leave her alone." Others continued recording, their phones held high as they captured every second of the unfolding confrontation. Lawson glanced at the other officers and gestured toward Linda. "We've got someone refusing to comply," he explained curtly. "Refusing to comply?" The phrase echoed in Linda's mind, filling her with a fresh wave of disbelief. She had done everything she could to provide proof and explain her situation, yet it was as if none of it mattered. "Mommy," Evan said again, his voice trembling, "I'm scared." Linda's heart broke at the sight of her son's tears. She leaned down to embrace him, her voice soft yet firm. "It's going to be okay," she said, though deep down she wasn't sure how. Bookmark. But Linda knew one thing for certain. She wouldn't let them take her dignity, no matter what came next. The air around the entrance gate felt heavy, the murmurs of the growing crowd blending with the distant hum of amusement park rides. Linda sat rigid in her wheelchair, her arms braced on the armrests, trying to keep her composure. Evan clung to her leg, his tear-streaked face turned upward, silently seeking comfort she struggled to provide. The situation felt like it was spiraling out of control. Officer Lawson stood stiffly before her, his condescending gaze locked on her, as though she were an inconvenience rather than a mother trying to enjoy a day out with her child. Beside him, Greg Thompson smirked, clearly satisfied with how things were unfolding. Linda's heart raced as she heard yet another police cruiser pull up nearby. She turned to see a tall figure step out of the car and stride quickly toward the scene. Relief and apprehension collided within her as she recognized Alan, her husband, his usually calm expression replaced with one of focused urgency. Alan's presence was commanding even without his badge. His strong, purposeful steps cut through the murmurs of the crowd as he made his way toward Linda and Evan. His eyes quickly assessed the situation, the officers, the security guard, the crowd, and most importantly, the fear etched on his wife's face. "Hey!" Alan's voice rang out, firm and clear, cutting through the noise like a blade. "What's going on here?" Officer Lawson turned to face him, his brows furrowed as he sized Alan up. "Who are you, and why are you interfering?" he asked sharply. Alan didn't falter. He stepped closer, his piercing gaze locking onto Lawson's. "I'm Alan Carter," he said, his tone measured but firm, "and that's my wife and son you're harassing. So I'll ask again, what's going on here?" Lawson's eyes narrowed. "Your wife has been asked to provide proof of her need for the accessible entrance, but she's refusing to cooperate," he replied tersely. "That's not true." Linda's voice trembled as she finally broke her silence. "I've shown my medical documents. I've explained everything." Alan glanced back at Linda, his jaw tightening as he saw the distress in her eyes. He then turned his attention back to Lawson, his tone now sharp. "She's in a wheelchair, for God's sake. She's pregnant and has medical complications. What more proof do you need?" Greg Thompson, emboldened by the officer's presence, chimed in smugly. "A lot of people fake disabilities to get special treatment," he said. "We're just doing our job, making sure no one cheats the system." Alan's eyes flicked to Thompson, his expression darkening. "You call this doing your job? Harassing a pregnant woman in front of her child? Is that what you think protecting and serving looks like?" Lawson's patience appeared to wear thin. He took a step toward Alan, his posture stiff. "Sir, I need you to back off," he said firmly. "You're interfering with an active situation. If you don't step away, I'll have no choice but to detain you." Alan let out a short, bitter laugh, his anger bubbling just below the surface. "Detain me?" he repeated incredulously. "You have no idea who you're dealing with." Reaching into his pocket, Alan pulled out his FBI badge, holding it up for Lawson and the other officers to see. The golden crest glinted in the sunlight, its weight carrying an authority that silenced the crowd momentarily. "I'm a federal agent," Alan said, his voice cold and deliberate. "And what I see here is a gross abuse of power and blatant discrimination." The atmosphere shifted. Lawson hesitated, his confident demeanor faltering for just a moment as his eyes darted between the badge and Alan's unyielding expression. But the pause was fleeting. "Federal agent or not, you're obstructing police work," Lawson said, doubling down. "Your badge doesn't give you the right to interfere here." Alan took a step closer, his voice dropping to a dangerous calm. "This isn't police work. This is harassment. And if you don't back off right now, you'll be answering to more than just me. You'll be answering to the Bureau." The crowd, emboldened by Alan's defiance, began to murmur louder. A few voices called out in agreement while others continued recording the encounter on their phones. "You tell him," one man shouted. "This is ridiculous." Lawson's partner, a younger officer who had arrived with the second cruiser, stepped forward hesitantly. "Maybe we should de-escalate," he said quietly to Lawson, his gaze flickering nervously to the growing crowd. But Lawson's pride wouldn't allow him to back down. "We're not letting this go," he barked. "This man's interfering, and she's refusing to comply. We'll handle this by the book." Alan's fists clenched at his sides, but he forced himself to remain calm. "Your by the book is trampling all over her rights," he said. "She has every right to use this entrance. She's done everything you've asked, provided documentation, and explained her situation. The only thing she's guilty of is trying to enjoy a day out with her family." Lawson's jaw tightened, his frustration evident. He turned to Linda, his hand moving toward the cuffs on his belt. "Ma'am, If you don't comply, I'll have no choice but to take you in, he said, his voice colder than ever. No, Evan cried, his small voice breaking through the tension. He clung to Linda's arm, his wide eyes filled with terror. Don't take my mommy? The raw fear in Evan's voice seemed to pierce through the chaos, drawing gasps from the crowd. Linda reached down, wrapping her arms around her son protectively. You're scaring him, she said, her voice trembling. Please, just stop. But Lawson didn't waver. He took another step forward, the cuffs glinting in his hand. Alan moved swiftly, stepping between Lawson and Linda. You're not laying a hand on her, he said, his voice low and steady, but filled with an unshakable resolve. For a moment, the two men stood face to face, the tension crackling like static electricity. The crowd fell silent, holding their breath as they watched the standoff. Sir, Lawson said finally, his voice laced with warning, if you don't step aside, I'll have to detain you too. Alan didn't move. Go ahead, he said, his tone daring. See how that works out for you. Before Lawson could respond, a new voice cut through the tension. What the hell is going on here? The crowd parted slightly as another officer approached, a sergeant judging by the stripes on his uniform. His stern expression scanned the scene, taking in the heated confrontation, the distressed family, and the growing crowd. Sergeant Reed, Lawson said, turning toward the newcomer. We've got a situation. I can see that, Reed interrupted sharply. And from where I'm standing, it looks like a mess. Alan stepped back slightly, his eyes still locked on Lawson. Sergeant, I'm Alan Carter, FBI, and unless you want this to blow up into a bigger mess, I suggest you listen carefully. The sergeant's eyes narrowed, but there was a flicker of recognition in his gaze. Go on, he said cautiously. This, Alan said, gesturing toward Linda and Evan, is my wife and son. They've been harassed, intimidated, and now threatened with arrest for what? Trying to use an accessible entrance they're entitled to? Reed's gaze shifted to Linda, who sat trembling in her wheelchair, Evan still clutching her leg. His expression softened slightly as he took in the scene, and he turned back to Lawson, his voice low but firm. Step back, he said. Lawson bristled. But that's an order. The crowd erupted into cheers as Lawson reluctantly stepped away, his frustration evident. Alan exhaled slowly, his body still tense as he moved to Linda's side, placing a protective hand on her shoulder. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. The tension at the park's accessible entrance was palpable, but the sergeant's order for Officer Lawson to step back sent a ripple of relief through Linda. Alan's hand rested on her shoulder, a silent promise that he would stand by her no matter what. Evan, still clutching his mother's leg, let out a soft sob, his small body trembling from the overwhelming fear. The gathered crowd had grown significantly, and their murmurs turned into vocalized support. Someone from the back yelled, "About time someone stood up to these guys." Another voice called out, "Leave her alone. She's done nothing wrong." Linda looked around, her heart heavy with a mix of gratitude and humiliation. Strangers were rallying behind her, recording the incident on their phones and calling out the injustice they witnessed. She wanted to thank them, but the lump in her throat made it impossible to speak. Sergeant Reed, now fully aware of the volatile atmosphere, turned to Greg Thompson, the security guard. "You called this in?" Reed's tone was clipped, a mix of annoyance and disbelief. Greg straightened his posture, his smugness slightly deflated under the sergeant's scrutiny. "Yes, sir," he said. "She claimed she needed access, but her papers didn't look right. And with all the scams we've been dealing with lately, I thought it best to call for backup." Reed's eyes narrowed, his expression unreadable as he glanced at Linda. "And did you actually look at her documents, or just assume she was lying?" Greg hesitated, his confidence faltering. Well, I checked them, but you know how easy it is to get fake paperwork these days." Reed held up a hand, cutting him off. "Enough." He turned back to Linda and Alan, his gaze lingering on Linda's pale face and trembling hands. "Ma'am," he said, his tone softer than before, "I'm sorry for any undue stress this situation has caused. Let's get this resolved." Alan, standing protectively beside Linda, didn't relax. "Resolved?" he echoed, his voice steady but laced with anger. "This shouldn't have escalated in the first place. My wife presented legitimate medical documents and explained her condition. She's been publicly humiliated and treated like a criminal for what? Sitting in a wheelchair while black? The sergeant stiffened at the pointed accusation, his lips pressing into a thin line. The crowd's murmurs grew louder, with several people shouting in agreement. "He's right," one woman exclaimed. "This is discrimination, plain and simple." Greg bristled, his face flushing with frustration. "This isn't about race," he snapped defensively. "We're just doing our job." Alan's gaze snapped to the guard, his eyes blazing. "Harassing a pregnant woman in front of her child isn't doing your job. It's an abuse of power." The sergeant held up his hands, signaling for calm. "Enough," he barked, his voice cutting through the commotion. "Let's focus on de-escalating the situation before it gets any worse." Alan stepped closer to Linda, his voice steady as he addressed the sergeant. "That's what I've been trying to do, but your officer and this guard have made that impossible. They've ignored her documents, dismissed her condition, and escalated this unnecessarily. And now you've got a crowd witnessing every second of it." Reed's jaw tightened, his gaze flicking to the phones held high in the crowd. He could feel the weight of their stares, the judgment in their eyes. The park's cheerful atmosphere had been replaced by an undercurrent of outrage, and the growing number of voices calling for accountability only added to the pressure. "Ma'am," Reed said, addressing Linda directly, "I understand this has been a difficult situation. If you allow it, we can escort you and your family to the accessible entrance and ensure you're able to enjoy the park without further issues." Linda's lips parted in shock at the sudden shift in tone. For the first time since the confrontation began, it seemed as though someone was willing to acknowledge her rights. But before she could respond, Greg muttered under his breath, "So now we're just letting anyone through?" Alan's head snapped toward the guard, his voice sharp and unwavering. "Say that again." The crowd erupted, their collective outrage drowning out any response Greg might have made. A middle-aged woman stepped forward from the crowd. Her phone held high as she spoke loudly enough for everyone to hear. "I've been recording this whole thing," she announced, "and I'm not the only one. We've got enough footage to make sure everyone sees how you've treated this family." A ripple of agreement moved through the crowd as others raised their phones in solidarity. Some shouted words of encouragement, while others demanded accountability for the officers and security personnel involved. Sergeant Reed visibly tensed, the weight of public scrutiny pressing down on him. "Everyone, please calm down," he said, his voice firm but measured. "We're handling the situation." The woman didn't back down. "You've been handling it by threatening and humiliating a pregnant woman," she countered. "We're not going to let this slide." Linda, overwhelmed by the support of strangers, felt tears prick her eyes. She reached down to stroke Evan's hair, trying to ground herself amidst the chaos. Alan took a deep breath, his voice steady as he addressed the sergeant. "If you're serious about resolving this, the first step is accountability. That means acknowledging the harm your officer and this guard have caused." Reed met Alan's gaze, his expression unreadable. After a tense pause, he nodded curtly. "I'll be filing a report on the incident," he said, "and I'll ensure it's reviewed by the department." The crowd erupted into a mix of cheers and skeptical murmurs, their voices reflecting both hope and doubt. Alan's jaw tightened, knowing this was only a small step toward justice. "That's not enough," Alan said firmly. "We'll be filing our own complaints and taking this to the appropriate channels. This kind of behavior won't go unanswered." Reed sighed, clearly aware that the situation had escalated far beyond his control. "You have every right to do so," he replied. "But for now, let's focus on ensuring your family's safety." He turned to Lawson and gestured for him to stand down. "Escort them to the entrance and make sure they're not disturbed again," Reed ordered. Lawson hesitated, his frustration evident, but ultimately obeyed. "Fine," he muttered, stepping aside to allow Linda's wheelchair to pass. As Alan moved to push Linda's wheelchair forward, the crowd parted, their cheers and words of encouragement ringing in the family's ears. "You're so brave," one woman said, her voice filled with admiration. "Don't let them get away with this," another added. Alan nodded in acknowledgement, his expression resolute. "We won't," he said, his voice loud enough for everyone to hear. Linda looked up at him, her eyes glistening with tears of gratitude. Despite everything, they had made it through this ordeal together. But as they passed through the gate, and into the park. She knew their fight wasn't over. The Carter family moved past the gate into the amusement park, but the tension of the encounter lingered like a storm cloud. Linda's hands trembled as she gripped the armrests of her wheelchair, her chest tight with the weight of what had just transpired. Evan walked close beside her, his small hand clutching her arm, still shaken from the confrontation. Alan stayed by her side, his face a mask of determination as he scanned the park's bustling pathways. Though the family had finally made it past the gate, Linda couldn't enjoy the colorful rides or the cheerful chatter of park visitors. Her mind replayed the sneers of Greg Thompson and the dismissive tone of Officer Lawson, each memory adding to the knot of humiliation and frustration in her chest. Alan leaned down toward her as they paused near a bench under the shade of a large tree. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice soft but filled with concern. Linda took a shaky breath and nodded, though the lump in her throat made it difficult to speak. "I will be," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Alan's jaw tightened. He knew that what had happened wouldn't be so easily forgotten. "Daddy?" Evan's voice broke through the tension. The boy's wide eyes, filled with lingering fear, looked up at his father. "Are those men going to come back? Are they going to take Mommy away?" Alan knelt down, his large hand resting reassuringly on Evan's shoulder. "No, buddy," he said firmly. "No one is going to take Mommy away. I promise you that." Evan nodded slowly, though his small hand still clung to his mother's arm. Linda reached out and stroked her son's hair. "It's okay, sweetheart," she said gently, though she wasn't sure if the words were more for Evan or for herself. By the time they left the park that evening, the videos captured by the crowd had already started spreading across social media. Clips of the confrontation showed Linda calmly presenting her medical documents, only to be dismissed and treated with hostility. Another video captured Alan stepping in, badge in hand, to defend his wife against Officer Lawson's threats. Headlines quickly emerged as the videos gained traction. "Pregnant woman harassed at amusement park entrance." FBI agent confronts local police over discrimination. Incident sparks outrage over treatment of disabled visitors. The comments poured in by the thousands. Some expressed outrage and support for the Carters. "This is unacceptable. Why was she treated like this? Thank you to her husband for standing up for her. We need more people like this. This is what systemic discrimination looks like in real time." Others were more skeptical, questioning the full context or defending the officers involved. "We don't know the whole story. Maybe the guard was just doing his job. Why didn't she just comply? Seems like they escalated it themselves." The mix of opinions only fueled the story's momentum, and within days, it was picked up by national news outlets. Linda and Alan found themselves at the center of a public firestorm. Sitting in their modest living room a few nights later, Alan and Linda stared at the television screen as a news anchor replayed clips from the confrontation. The anchor's voice was calm but tinged with disapproval. "Tonight, we're following a story that has sparked a nationwide debate about discrimination and the treatment of disabled individuals," she said. What began as a family outing at Silver Pines Amusement Park has now become a rallying cry for change. Alan muted the TV, running a hand over his face as he turned to Linda. "This isn't going away," he said quietly. Linda, seated on the couch with Evan curled up beside her, nodded. "It shouldn't," she replied. "What happened to us wasn't right, and if we don't speak up, they'll just keep getting away with it." Alan reached for his phone, scrolling through the contact list until he found the name of an old friend, Mark Taylor, a civil rights attorney who had handled cases of police misconduct. "We'll need someone who knows how to navigate this," Alan said as he dialed. Mark answered on the second ring, his voice warm and familiar. "Alan, it's been a while," he said. "What's going on?" Alan took a deep breath, recounting the events at the park in detail. Mark listened intently, occasionally interjecting with questions to clarify specifics. "This is bigger than just one bad security guard or one overzealous officer," Mark said finally. "You're talking about systemic problems, biases against both disabled individuals and people of color. If you're ready to pursue this, I'll help you every step of the way." "We're ready," Alan said, his voice steady. Mark paused before speaking again. "Then let's make sure this doesn't get swept under the rug." The days that followed were a whirlwind. Local activists reached out to the Carters, organizing a rally to bring attention to the incident. Civil rights organizations issued statements condemning the behavior of the security guard and police officers involved, while disability advocacy groups called for better training and stricter accountability measures. Alan and Linda found themselves fielding calls from reporters, lawyers, and community leaders. Their story had struck a nerve, highlighting how easily those in positions of authority could abuse their power under the guise of following procedure. The rally, scheduled for the following weekend, quickly gained momentum. Flyers and social media posts spread the word, calling on people to gather at City Hall to demand justice for Linda and accountability for those responsible. Linda felt a mix of emotions as the rally approached. At the same time, she was grateful for the outpouring of support. The idea of standing in front of a crowd to relieve the humiliation she had experienced filled her with dread. Alan noticed her apprehension as they sat together in the quiet of their home one evening. "You don't have to speak if you're not ready," he said gently. Linda shook her head. "This isn't just about me," she said. "It's about every person who's been treated like they don't matter. If my voice can make a difference, I need to use it." Alan placed his hand over hers, pride shining in his eyes. "We'll do this together," he said. On the morning of the rally, the Carters stood at the base of the City Hall steps, looking out at the crowd that had gathered. Hundreds of people had shown up, holding signs with messages like, "Justice for Linda," "End police bias," and "Accessible rights are human rights." Alan adjusted the microphone, his gaze sweeping over the sea of faces. He took a deep breath, preparing to address the crowd. "We came to that park expecting a day of joy," he began, his voice steady and clear. "But instead, we were met with suspicion, hostility, and humiliation, all because someone decided my wife didn't look disabled enough to deserve basic respect." The crowd murmured in agreement, their attention locked on Alan as he continued. "This isn't just about what happened to us," he said. "It's about a system that allows this kind of treatment to happen over and over again. And it's about making sure it stops, here and now." The applause that followed was thunderous. A wave of support that bolstered Linda as she stepped forward to take the microphone. The crowd fell silent as Linda took the microphone from Alan, her hands trembling slightly as she adjusted it. The sea of faces before her reflected a mix of determination, empathy, and anger on her behalf. The sheer weight of their support steadied her, and she took a deep breath before speaking. "My name is Linda Carter," she began, her voice soft but clear. "I'm a mother, a wife, and someone who, like all of you, just wanted to enjoy a day at the park with my family." The crowd murmured in acknowledgement, their encouragement bolstering her confidence. But instead, Linda continued, her voice growing stronger, "I was treated like I didn't belong, like I didn't matter. Because I'm a black woman in a wheelchair, someone decided I must be lying, that I couldn't possibly have a legitimate need to use the accessible entrance. And when I tried to defend myself, I was met with hostility and humiliation." A ripple of outrage swept through the crowd. People shook their heads and exchanged angry whispers, their frustration palpable. Linda paused, glancing at Alan and Evan, who stood just behind her. Alan's steady gaze gave her strength, while Evan's wide, innocent eyes reminded her why she was standing there. "What happened to me isn't unique," she said, her voice firm. "It's a part of a much bigger problem, a problem that affects so many people in our communities. Whether it's because of race, disability, or both, too many of us are forced to prove our worth, to justify our existence, just to access basic rights and respect." The crowd erupted into applause, their voices rising in solidarity. Linda's hand tightened around the microphone as she continued. "I didn't speak up at that moment because I was scared of what they might do to me in front of my son. But I'm speaking up now because no one should have to feel that fear. No one should have to defend their dignity against those who abuse their authority." Her voice broke slightly on the last word, but she held her ground. The crowd responded with chants of, "We're with you," and "Justice for Linda." Looking out at the crowd, Linda's heart swelled with gratitude. She realized that this wasn't just her fight anymore. It was a collective movement for change. After Linda stepped back from the microphone, wiping away a stray tear. Other speakers came forward to share their own stories. A man in a motorized wheelchair recounted an instance where he was denied entry to a restaurant because the staff didn't want to accommodate his needs. A young black woman spoke about being followed around a store, assumed to be shoplifting simply because of the color of her skin. Each testimony painted a picture of systemic bias and prejudice, adding weight to the Carters' fight for justice. The crowd listened intently, their energy growing with each story, their chants of "enough is enough" growing louder. Alan stood with his arm around Linda's shoulders, his heart swelling with pride at her courage. He knew how much it had taken for her to speak out, to relive the pain and humiliation of that day at the park. Evan, holding on to his father's hand, looked up at his mother with awe. "Mommy, you're really brave," he said, his voice filled with admiration. Linda knelt down, wrapping her arms around her son. "Thank you, sweetheart," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "And so are you." The rally made headlines the following day. Images of Linda standing at the microphone, Alan holding up his FBI badge, and Evan clinging to his mother's side dominated news reports. Anchors spoke about the systemic issues highlighted by the incident, the racial bias that led to Linda's initial harassment, the lack of accountability for security guards and police officers who overstepped their authority, the broader societal disregard for the needs and rights of disabled individuals. Civil rights organizations and disability advocacy groups amplified the Carters' story on social media, using hashtags like Justice for Linda and Stop the Bias to rally support. The videos from the rally were shared thousands of times, with messages of solidarity pouring in from across the country. Linda received emails and messages from strangers who shared their own stories of discrimination and thanked her for speaking out. One particularly heartfelt message came from a single mother in a wheelchair, who wrote, "Your courage gave me hope. I've faced so many moments like yours, but never had the strength to fight back. Thank you for standing up for all of us." Reading these messages brought tears to Linda's eyes, but it also strengthened her resolve. She realized that her voice had the power to make a difference, not just for herself but for countless others. Meanwhile, Alan worked tirelessly with their attorney, Mark Taylor, to build their case against Officer Lawson, Greg Thompson, and the police department. Mark outlined a two-pronged approach. 1. Legal action. Filing a formal lawsuit for harassment, discrimination, and violation of civil rights. 2. Public pressure. Leveraging the media attention to push for broader reforms in police training and accountability. "This isn't just about one incident," Mark explained during a meeting at the Carters' home. "It's about addressing the culture that allows this kind of behavior to happen in the first place." Alan nodded, his determination unwavering. "We're not backing down," he said. "They need to understand that their actions have consequences." Linda, seated beside him, placed her hand on his. "We're in this together," she said firmly. Under mounting public pressure, the police department announced that Officer Lawson had been placed on administrative leave pending an internal investigation. Greg Thompson, the security guard, was temporarily suspended by the amusement park's management. While these steps were a small victory, the Carters knew it was only the beginning. They continued to push for bigger changes, demanding mandatory training for law enforcement and security personnel on handling situations involving race and disability. Community leaders rallied behind them, organizing more events and petitions to keep the momentum alive. The Carters became symbols of resilience and justice, their story inspiring others to speak out against the injustices they had faced. Late one evening, as the Carters prepared for another press interview, Linda sat with Alan and Evan in the living room. The weight of their fight hung heavily in the air, but so did a sense of purpose. "Do you think they'll really change?" Evan asked, his innocent eyes filled with curiosity. Alan looked at his son, then at Linda, before answering. "Change doesn't happen overnight," he said. "But every step we take brings us closer to a better world. And by standing up for what's right, we're helping make that change possible." Linda smiled at Evan, her heart full despite the challenges they faced. "And we're doing it together," she added. The sound of the television in the background carried a news anchor's voice. "The Carter family continues to inspire as their fight for justice gains national attention." As Linda leaned back on the couch, she felt a flicker of hope. They had a long road ahead, but for the first time she truly believed they could make a difference, not just for themselves, but for everyone who had been silenced by injustice. The Carters' living room had become a makeshift war room. Papers, laptops, and legal documents were scattered across the coffee table, and the glow of Alan's laptop illuminated his determined expression as he typed furiously. Linda sat beside him, sorting through folders of correspondence from advocacy groups, while Evan played quietly nearby, seemingly aware of the seriousness of his parents' work. The momentum their case had gained felt both empowering and overwhelming. Headlines still buzzed with updates, and the viral videos sparked debates across social media and cable news. But behind the scenes, the Carters were preparing for a much larger fight, a lawsuit against the Silver Pines amusement park, Officer Lawson, and the police department. "Mark says we have a strong case," Alan said, glancing up from his laptop. "Between the videos, witness statements, and your medical records, there's enough evidence to hold them accountable." Linda nodded, her face resolute. "Good," she said, "because this isn't just about us anymore. It's about making sure this doesn't happen to anyone else." Alan leaned back, rubbing his temples. "The department's investigation into Lawson is moving slower than I'd like, but at least he's on administrative leave," he said. "Greg Thompson's suspension from the park is a start, but they haven't committed to any real changes." Linda frowned. "Temporary suspensions won't fix a system built on bias," she said. "We need more than disciplinary action. We need reform." The first court filing made national headlines. Carter family files civil rights lawsuit after park incident. FBI agent and pregnant wife take on police department. A family's fight against harassment gains national attention. Mark Taylor held a press conference on the courthouse steps flanked by Alan and Linda. The attorney's voice was calm but commanding as he outlined the basis of their lawsuit. The actions taken against Linda Carter on that day were not just inappropriate. They were illegal, Mark said. "This case is about protecting the rights of every individual, regardless of race, disability, or circumstance. No one should have to endure the kind of humiliation and mistreatment this family faced." Reporters peppered the Carters with questions, but Alan and Linda maintained their composure. Alan's background as an FBI agent brought additional scrutiny, with some questioning whether his involvement had escalated the situation. "Do you think revealing your badge caused more tension?" one reporter asked. Alan's jaw tightened, but he answered steadily. "I revealed my badge to de-escalate the situation," he said. "My wife had already provided her documents and was still being harassed. If my intervention made the officers uncomfortable, perhaps they should reflect on why they were acting unlawfully in the first place." Linda added, "This isn't about one officer or one security guard. It's about the broader issue of systemic bias, and we're not stopping until real change happens." As the legal proceedings gained traction, the Carters faced new challenges at home. The constant media attention was exhausting, and Linda struggled to shield Evan from the negativity that occasionally crept into news reports and online comments. One evening, as Linda prepared dinner, Evan sat at the kitchen table, coloring in a sketchbook. He looked up suddenly and asked, "Mommy, why are some people saying mean things about us on TV?" Linda paused, her heart sinking at the question. She set down the knife she was using and walked over to sit beside her son. "Sometimes, when people don't understand something, they say things that aren't kind," she explained gently. "But we didn't do anything wrong," Evan said, his small brow furrowing. "No, we didn't," Linda said firmly. "And that's why we're standing up for ourselves and for others. Sometimes, doing the right thing means facing people who don't agree with you." Evan nodded slowly, though the worry in his eyes lingered. Linda kissed the top of his head, silently vowing to protect him from as much of the ugliness as she could. Alan joined them at the table, sensing the weight of the conversation. "We're stronger together," he said, placing a reassuring hand on Evan's shoulder. "And no matter what anyone says, we're doing this because it's the right thing to do." Evan offered a small smile, his father's words giving him a measure of comfort. The outpouring of public support for the Carters didn't waver. Community leaders organized town hall meetings to address the systemic issues highlighted by the case, while local businesses and organizations offered their backing. At one town hall, a young woman in a wheelchair shared her story. "When I saw the video of what happened to Linda, it felt like I was watching my own life," she said, her voice breaking. "I've been denied access, questioned, and humiliated more times than I can count. But seeing someone fight back, seeing someone refuse to be silenced, gives me hope." Linda, seated in the front row beside Alan, wiped away tears as she listened. She had never imagined her experience could resonate so deeply with others. But the stories she heard reinforced her resolve. Alan stood to speak next, his voice steady and commanding as he addressed the room. "This fight isn't just ours," he said. "It's for everyone who's been treated unfairly, everyone who's been made to feel less than, and together, we're going to make sure this fight leads to change." The crowd erupted into applause, their collective determination filling the room. As the lawsuit progressed, the police department faced increasing pressure. Public protests outside the station called for Officer Lawson's termination, while online petitions demanding reform amassed tens of thousands of signatures. The department responded with a press release promising to review its training protocols and improve oversight of officers' actions. However, many, including the Carters, viewed the statement as a weak attempt to placate critics without implementing meaningful change. "They're trying to sweep this under the rug," Alan told Mark during a strategy meeting. "We need to keep the pressure on." Mark nodded. "We'll use their own statements against them in court," he said. "The public is on your side, and the evidence is overwhelmingly in your favor. They can't ignore this." Linda chimed in. "It's not just about winning the case," she said. "It's about making sure no one else has to go through what we did." The Carter story continued to spark discussions across the country, appearing in op-eds, panel discussions, and social media campaigns. Influential figures, including activists and lawmakers, began weighing in, calling for federal guidelines to address bias in law enforcement and public accommodations. For Linda, the scope of their impact was both humbling and empowering. One morning, as she read through messages of support on her phone, she came across a quote that resonated deeply. "Courage is not the absence of fear, but the determination to act in spite of it." She shared it with Alan, who smiled and said, "That's exactly what you've been doing, and it's what's going to carry us through." Linda nodded, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. Their fight was far from over, but with the growing support of their community and the nation, she knew they were making progress. The courtroom was packed to capacity as the case of Linda Carter v. Silver Pines Amusement Park and Officer James Lawson began. Reporters filled the back rows, their pens poised and cameras discreetly tucked away. Supporters of the Carter family lined the benches, their faces reflecting quiet determination. Linda and Alan sat at the plaintiff's table alongside their attorney, Mark Taylor, who was meticulously organizing his notes. Alan reached for Linda's hand and gave it a reassuring squeeze. "This is it," he whispered. "We've got the truth on our side." Linda nodded, though her stomach churned with nervous anticipation. This wasn't just about their family anymore. It was about holding a system accountable and setting a precedent for others who had been silenced or ignored. The judge, a stern-looking woman with graying hair, called the court to order. Mark stood to deliver his opening statement, his voice steady and authoritative. "This case is about more than just one incident," he began. "It's about a pattern of behavior, a system that allows bias and discrimination to go unchecked. My client, Linda Carter, a disabled woman in the late stages of pregnancy, was treated with suspicion, hostility, and outright contempt. Despite providing medical documentation, she was humiliated in front of her child and subjected to unnecessary force. This is not justice. This is not equality. And today, we seek accountability." The opposing counsel, representing the amusement park and the police department, framed their argument differently. The lawyer, a sharp-suited man named Douglas Grant, leaned on procedural rhetoric. "This case, while unfortunate, is not one of systemic failure," he argued. "It is a misunderstanding, an isolated incident blown out of proportion. My clients acted in accordance with their duties to ensure public safety and prevent fraudulent claims. We will prove that their actions, while imperfect, were justified." Linda clenched her fists under the table. Hearing their experiences reduced to a misunderstanding stung deeply, but she knew they had the evidence to refute it. The first day of testimony belonged to Linda. Mark guided her through her account of the events, allowing her to explain in detail how the day unfolded. Linda's voice wavered slightly as she described her initial interaction with Greg Thompson. I showed him my medical documents, explained my condition, and even offered to answer any questions, she said. But he didn't care. He dismissed me like I didn't matter. When Mark asked about the arrival of Officer Lawson, Linda's tone grew firmer. I told him the same thing I told the guard. I showed him my documents, but he didn't believe me either. He demanded I stand up to prove I couldn't walk. When I refused, he threatened to arrest me. All of this happened in front of my son. Mark paused, letting her words settle before asking, "And how did this experience affect you and your family?" Linda's eyes glistened as she answered. "It broke something in me," she said softly. "To be treated like a criminal because of my race and my disability, it was humiliating. But what hurt most was seeing my son afraid, seeing him question whether his mother would be taken away." The courtroom was silent except for the faint scribbling of reporters taking notes. Even the opposing counsel seemed momentarily subdued. Douglas Grant began his cross-examination with a patronizing tone. "Mrs. Carter," he said, "would you agree that security personnel have a duty to verify claims made by park visitors to ensure fairness?" Linda's jaw tightened. "I would agree that they have a duty to treat people with respect," she replied, her voice steady. Grant smirked as if satisfied with her response. "And would you also agree that misunderstandings can happen, especially in a busy, high-pressure environment like an amusement park?" Linda met his gaze without flinching. "Misunderstandings can happen," she said, "but what I experienced wasn't a misunderstanding. It was discrimination." The courtroom murmured in approval, and Grant shifted uncomfortably before moving on. Allen's testimony followed, and his presence immediately commanded the room. In his crisp suit and confident demeanor, he exuded authority. Mark began by asking Allen to recount the moment he arrived at the park. "When I saw my wife surrounded by officers, I knew something was wrong," Allen said. "She was visibly distressed, and my son was clinging to her, crying. As soon as I approached, it was clear that the officers weren't interested in resolving the situation. They were focused on asserting their authority." Mark nodded. "And how did you respond?" Allen's expression hardened. "I identified myself as an FBI agent and tried to de-escalate the situation. I reminded them of my wife's rights and showed my badge to assert my credibility. But instead of backing down, Officer Lawson doubled down, threatening to arrest both my wife and me." Grant's cross-examination of Allen was sharper, probing whether Allen's intervention had exacerbated the situation. "Mr. Carter, do you think flashing your FBI badge might have been perceived as intimidating?" Grant asked. Allen's brow furrowed. "I didn't flash my badge," he said firmly. "I presented it as proof of my credentials because the officers refused to listen. My goal was to protect my family, not escalate the situation." Grant smirked. "Protect them by interfering in police work?" Allen leaned forward slightly, his voice calm but resolute. "Interfering in police work? No. Intervening in an abuse of power? Absolutely." The courtroom murmured again, and Grant's smug expression faltered. Perhaps the most damning evidence presented was the videos recorded by bystanders. The clips showed Linda calmly presenting her documents, Officer Lawson dismissing her, and Allen stepping in to defend her. The footage also captured Lawson grabbing Linda's wheelchair and pulling it backward, eliciting gasps from the courtroom. Mark stood before the jury as the final video played. "This is not the behavior of someone acting in good faith," he said, pointing at the paused frame of Lawson's sneering face. "This is the behavior of someone who saw an opportunity to exert power over a vulnerable person and took it." The defense attempted to downplay the footage, suggesting it didn't capture the full context. But the damage was done. The jury had seen enough to understand the heart of the matter. In the days that followed, additional witnesses took the stand, including park employees and members of the crowd who had recorded the incident. Their testimonies corroborated Linda and Allen's accounts, painting a clear picture of bias and overreach. One witness, a middle-aged woman who had been at the park with her grandchildren, delivered a particularly powerful statement. "I saw how they treated her," she said, her voice trembling. "They didn't see a mother. They didn't see a woman who needed help. They saw a problem to get rid of, and that's not right." By the time closing arguments began, the atmosphere in the courtroom was electric. Mark delivered a passionate plea for accountability, while Grant struggled to maintain a narrative of procedural errors and miscommunication. As the judge dismissed the court for deliberations, Linda exhaled deeply, leaning into Alan's reassuring presence. The wait for a verdict had begun, but in her heart, she already felt a sense of victory. They had spoken their truth, and the world was listening. Alan wrapped an arm around her shoulders. "Whatever happens next, we've already made a difference," he said. Linda nodded, her resolve unshaken. "And we're not done yet." The courtroom was filled with a tense silence as everyone waited for the jury to return. Linda sat between Alan and Mark at the plaintiff's table, her fingers interlaced tightly, her knuckles white. Alan's hand rested lightly on her back, a steadying presence as the weight of the moment pressed down on them. Evan wasn't there. He was safely at home with a close family friend. Linda had insisted, not wanting him to witness this part of their fight. But she couldn't help thinking about him, his wide eyes full of hope and worry. When the jury finally filed back into the room, every pair of eyes followed them. The foreperson, a woman in her 50s with a serious expression, carried a folded sheet of paper in her hands. The judge took the paper, her face giving nothing away, as she read it. Then she cleared her throat and addressed the court. "In the matter of Linda Carter v. Silver Pines Amusement Park and Officer James Lawson, the jury finds as follows." Linda held her breath, her heart pounding so loudly she could barely hear the words. "For the claim of discrimination, the jury finds in favor of the plaintiff, Linda Carter." A wave of relief washed over Linda as murmurs rippled through the courtroom. She felt Alan's hand squeeze her shoulder, his silent way of saying, "We did it. For the claim of excessive force, the jury finds in favor of the plaintiff, Linda Carter." The murmurs grew louder, with supporters in the gallery exchanging quiet nods and smiles. For the claim of negligence on the part of Silver Pines Amusement Park, the jury finds in favor of the plaintiff, Linda Carter. The final ruling carried an unmistakable weight. Linda's truth had been validated. The judge continued, "The court orders that the defendants pay damages to the plaintiff in the amount of $1.2 million. Furthermore, the court recommends mandatory diversity and disability sensitivity training for all staff involved, including law enforcement officers associated with the case." The words felt like a balm to Linda's frayed nerves. It wasn't just the financial compensation. It was the acknowledgement that the system had failed her and needed to change. Mark leaned over, whispering, "This is more than we hoped for. You should be proud." Linda nodded, tears brimming in her eyes. "I am," she whispered. Outside the courthouse, a large crowd had gathered, holding signs that read "Justice for Linda" and "Accountability Matters." When Linda, Alan, and Mark stepped out, the crowd erupted into cheers. Reporters surged forward, cameras flashing as they tried to capture the family's reaction. Mark stepped aside, letting Linda and Alan take center stage. Linda adjusted the microphone set up for the press conference, taking a deep breath before speaking. "Today's verdict is a step toward justice," she said, her voice steady but emotional. "What happened to me was not just about one day or one incident. It was about a system that fails to protect the most vulnerable and often targets them instead. While I'm relieved and grateful for this outcome, our work isn't done." The crowd clapped and cheered, their support unwavering. Alan stepped forward, his tone firm and resolute. "This case wasn't just about my wife and my family," he said. "It was about sending a message that abuse of power, discrimination, and neglect of basic rights will not be tolerated. We will continue to fight until real reform is implemented, not just here, but everywhere." The applause grew louder, and for a moment, Linda allowed herself to soak in the collective strength of the people around her. In the weeks that followed the verdict, the fallout was significant. Officer Lawson was officially terminated from the police force and faced charges of misconduct and excessive force. The amusement park, under immense public pressure, announced sweeping changes to its accessibility policies, including mandatory training for all staff and a revised system for handling accommodations. Linda and Alan also became symbols of resilience and advocacy. They were invited to speak at conferences, town halls, and even a national disability rights summit. Their story was featured in newspapers and documentaries, shining a spotlight on the intersections of race, disability, and systemic bias. One day, as Linda prepared for a speaking engagement, she found Evan sitting at the kitchen table, drawing a picture. It showed their family standing together, holding signs that read, "Justice and Hope." "Is this us?" Linda asked, smiling as she ruffled his hair. Evan nodded, his eyes bright. "Yeah, I want to show people that we're strong." Linda hugged him tightly, her heart full. "We are strong," she said, "and we're going to help others be strong too." Alan and Linda used part of the settlement to establish a foundation dedicated to supporting families affected by discrimination and advocating for policy changes. The Carter Foundation for Equality and Accessibility quickly gained traction, partnering with civil rights groups and disability organizations to amplify its message. Through their work, the Carters met countless individuals whose lives had been shaped by similar experiences. Each story strengthened their resolve, reminding them why their fight was so important. "Every time we stand up, we make it easier for the next person to do the same," Linda said during one of the foundation's events. Alan, standing beside her, added, "This isn't just about justice for the past, it's about building a future where no one has to endure what we did." Months after the verdict, the Carters visited Silver Pines Amusement Park again, not as visitors, but as honored guests at the unveiling of a new accessibility initiative. The park had revamped its accommodations, adding clear signage, dedicated staff for disability assistance, and a zero-tolerance policy for discrimination. As Linda wheeled down a smooth, shaded pathway with Evan skipping beside her, she felt a sense of closure. The place that had once been the site of her humiliation was now a symbol of progress, a reminder that change was possible. Alan leaned down, whispering in her ear, "We turned this into something good. I'm proud of you." Linda smiled, her heart light. "I'm proud of us," she said. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky with hues of gold and pink, Linda, Alan, and Evan walked out of the park hand in hand. They knew their journey wasn't over. There was still work to be done, battles to fight, and voices to amplify. But they also knew they weren't alone. Their story had become a catalyst for change, a beacon of hope for others facing their own struggles. And as they moved forward, they carried with them a powerful truth: that together they could overcome anything. The story of the Carter family is one of resilience, justice, and the enduring fight against systemic bias. What began as a simple family outing to an amusement park became a turning point, not just for Linda, Alan, and Evan, but for everyone who has ever been silenced, dismissed, or treated unfairly. This story highlights how courage, when paired with determination and support, can transform pain into progress. At its heart, this tale is a reminder of the importance of standing up for what's right, even when the odds seem insurmountable. Linda's bravery in the face of humiliation, Alan's unwavering protection of his family, and the collective voices of the community all served as catalysts for meaningful change. Together, they demonstrated that no matter how powerful the forces of injustice may seem, they can be confronted and overcome with unity and resolve. This story also sheds light on deeper lessons: the importance of empathy, the need for accountability, and the enduring strength found in love and family. It challenges each of us to examine how we treat others, especially those who may already feel vulnerable or unseen. Every action, whether it's a word of support, an act of kindness, or the courage to speak up, can make a difference. The Carters' journey isn't just their own, it's a beacon of hope for all of us. Their fight reminds us that progress is possible, but only if we commit to making it happen. If this story inspired you, let us know. Comment 1 if you found it moving, and comment 2 if you think it was absolutely amazing. Your voice matters, and we'd love to hear your own experiences too. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you won't miss the incredible stories we have coming your way. Share your thoughts and reflections in the comments below. Your perspective is what makes this community special. Together, let's keep the conversation going and continue to inspire.